Research in the Mississippi-Rideau source water protection region has shown that overburden thickness is one of the most important factors for limiting contaminant transport from the surface to groundwater wells. Where soil is thin or absent over fractured rock, underlying aquifers are more vulnerable to contamination than unconsolidated aquifers like sand and gravel. A study in the Mississippi region found E. coli occurrence was higher where wells were drilled in bare bedrock outcrops compared to areas with thicker overlying soil. In this same area, contaminants have the potential to enter wells as deep as 50 meters in unconfined granitic bedrock aquifers. Even confined bedrock aquifers can be vulnerable to contaminants like human viruses due to natural weaknesses in the confining layer or due to failures in well construction. The time contaminants can take to travel from the surface to a pumping well can be on the order of minutes to hours at shallow depths. Once a contaminant enters a fractured rock aquifer, it can travel at velocities that are orders of magnitude higher than soils. Bacteria can travel at even higher velocities than dissolved contaminants. For example, in the granitic rock of the Mississippi-Rideau source protection region, transport velocities to a shallow well were found to be approximately 40 meters per day for a chemical tracer. This is compared to 115 meters per day for a bacterial tracer. Fecal bacteria can survive for weeks in soil and almost a year in a fractured rock aquifer. They can also reside in shallow soils and fractured rock above the water table and get repeatedly flushed into the groundwater during precipitation events. Research has shown that contaminants, including bacteria and viruses, can travel horizontal distances ranging from tens of meters to up to many kilometers in fractured rock. Travel distances of tens of kilometers are also possible in carbonate aquifers with large karst dissolution channels. It is therefore critical to assess all possible sources of contamination in an area at scales exceeding setback regulations before drilling a well in a highly vulnerable aquifer. Many urban centers in Ontario are situated in the middle of highly productive agricultural land. In most cases, outward expansion of these centers convert farmland for urban purposes, including residential, industrial, commercial, institutional, and recreational sites. This pressure is increasing as the population of Ontario continues to grow, and is predicted to grow at rapid rates over the next several decades. For example, urbanization and population growth are expected to increase significantly in the northern region of the Greater Toronto Area, placing pressures on historically rural regions of central Ontario. In the context of southeastern Ontario, populations are projected to grow an estimated 27% by the year 2046. Studies have shown that contamination events that threaten the quality of groundwater supplies may be particularly pronounced in areas with increasing peri-urban sprawl and population growth. This is particularly the case in southern Ontario, where rapid urban expansion has resulted from significant economic growth in metropolitan areas. Research in the Mississippi-Rideau source water protection region has shown that as rural housing density increases, so does the occurrence of viruses in groundwater wells due to the increase in septic sources. Proximity to farm fields has been cited across the literature as a potential source of contamination in private well water. For example, zero-till farming and higher density of large animals has been associated with an increased risk of E. coli contamination. Contamination of groundwater by livestock can result if runoff from manure storage or a feedlot percolate through the soil close to a functioning well, or when manure is spread onto cropland. Private well water contamination in Ontario is typically characterized in one of two ways: localized source-specific contamination and generalized aquifer contamination. Most research on private well water contamination in Ontario suggests that wells are frequently contaminated by localized pathways. Localized mechanisms tend to be related to direct bacterial ingress at the wellhead, as a result of poorly constructed or maintained wells. In addition, rapid and/or shallow preferential groundwater pathways, i.e. bypass mechanisms, may result in higher contaminant concentrations occurring due to high precipitation events and surface runoff. Generalized contamination of aquifers, although less common, can occur when contaminants from a number of land uses and locations enter the aquifer and affect water quality at a larger geographic scale. In addition, research has shown that sampling frequency can be important when monitoring the water quality of aquifers. For instance, month of sample has been associated with an increased risk of both E. coli and total coliform contamination in private well water. Research in Ontario has shown that summer and fall can have significantly higher E. coli detection rates, which are defined as the proportion of E. coli positive wells, i.e. the number of wells in which E. coli bacteria are detected relative to the number of wells in the sample population. This is compared to winter and spring and is hypothesized to be a result of higher single-day rainfall events and corresponding agricultural practices, i.e. grazing and manure spreading, which traditionally commences in the late spring or early summer. Precipitation, warmer weather, and agricultural practices have all been shown to have an impact on groundwater quality and influence E. coli detection. Thus, well owners may be faced with an increased risk of well water contamination during warmer months, which may result in a waterborne infection. These findings may be used to inform guidelines for well owners regarding the most appropriate time to test their water supplies. For example, given the increase in E. coli detection in the warmer months, i.e. June, July, and August, increased sampling frequency during the summer months may provide a more realistic picture of overall well water quality. Although Public Health Ontario does not currently specify an empiric recommendation for well water testing, the federal guideline is to test a minimum of 2 times per year. It is important to note that most testing recommendations rely on a more generalized approach and do not account for the site-specific or temporal factors that influence private well susceptibility to microbial contamination. Interestingly, most private well owners can recognize agriculture as a potential source of contamination to their drinking water source. This is likely due to the Walkerton outbreak of 2000, where over 2,000 fell ill due to fecal contamination of a municipal well from a nearby farm. Previous research on the source of contamination of private well water in Ontario has revealed that half of all wells tested were contaminated by human fecal sources as a result of septic system leakage. Human feces can contain pathogenic bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, which can result in a human health risk such as acute gastrointestinal illness. Further, previous research has also attributed private well contamination to several septic system characteristics, including distance between well and septic system. Given these risk factors, an increase in housing development, and by proxy, septic systems, may impact the quality of local groundwater given the potential contamination pathways which may be present. Private well regulation in Ontario indicates that a well must be situated a minimum of 50 feet or 15 meters from the septic system and must not be located near runoff streams or any other water flow areas such as ponds and ditches. However, many wells in Ontario were established prior to these regulations and do not always follow the minimum setback distance. Further, while the minimum setback distance is required, there are certain situations in which there is a benefit to exceed 50 feet. Or 15 meters, specifically when a well is located in a highly vulnerable aquifer. For example, recommended best practices for setback, where there are natural features of the bedrock of the well site facilitating rapid transit of contaminants, a characteristic feature of highly vulnerable aquifers, would be to exceed this minimum distance. This best practice is also recommended if the well is going to be situated in a shallow aquifer or located down gradient from a potential contaminant source. Research has also shown that fecal bacteria and viruses can travel horizontal distances from 40 meters to over 4 kilometers. Thus, it is important to give consideration to the effect of increasing septic density development in highly vulnerable aquifer areas. Human activities play an increasingly influential role in hydrogeological systems, and particularly in the context of private, unregulated drinking water wells, as the onus to safeguard private wells rests entirely with well owners. Unlike consumers receiving water from regulated public systems, private well users are responsible for well stewardship, including maintaining, treating, and testing the quality of their drinking water supplies. Previous research in Ontario has shown low testing rates for users of private wells. This is likely due to gaps in knowledge of the importance of routine testing, as users have the opportunity to submit well water tests free of charge for microbial contaminant indicators through Public Health Ontario. For example, a previous study covering the years 2008 to 2012 found that just 11 to 12% of well owners followed historic provincial water testing guideline of 3 tests per year. More recently, a study covering the years 2012 to 2016 found that only 27.5% of wells in southern Ontario were tested during that period, and that only 66.7% were sampled more than once. Various water treatment methods are available for well users at the residential level to improve the quality of well water supplies. Such treatment methods can be used to remove specific contaminants and/or improve the taste of drinking water. Research conducted in municipalities across Canada reported that approximately 50% of well users do not employ any treatment systems for their private drinking water supplies. In the context of southern Ontario, it was found that 57% of surveyed well owners reported an absence of a water treatment device that targeted bacterial contamination. Treatment systems that are used to protect against most enteric pathogens include shocking the well with chlorine, a chlorinator for the water within the house, a UV light, reverse osmosis, membrane filtration, and boiling. However, well users that solely use water filters, such as water softeners, external refrigerator filters, and carbon filters for their household drinking water, may not recognize that these devices have a limited capacity to protect against microbial contaminants. Given the potential risk for waterborne infection associated with private well water supplies and the lack of associated regulation, it is critical to understand and address well user awareness, attitudes, perceptions, experiences, socio-demographics, and their potential contribution to contamination and waterborne infection. Previous studies in Ontario indicate that knowledge and perceptions of risk associated with the consumption of contaminated groundwater, knowledge of well water testing and treatment, attitudes toward testing, structural constraints, i.e. the convenience of dropping off a sample bottle for testing, history of previous contamination or illness, and complacency are among the most important determinants of well water stewardship behaviors. Moreover, well users that are not familiar with common water contaminants or well maintenance practices may not be able to make informed choices that protect the health of both themselves and their household members. These findings represent a major concern due to the ubiquity of contaminant sources in rural areas. As such, local municipalities, community organizations, and users must all take responsibility and serve as the main political actors in maintaining and sustaining the quality and quantity of groundwater resources. The findings of the research of the Mississippi-Rideau Source Water Protection Region can be grouped into four main themes. First, soil and overburden thickness, along with underlying geology, play an important role in the protection of aquifers from contamination. Second, agricultural practices and rural residential intensification can bring contamination impacts on local aquifers due to increases in nutrient and wastewater management pressures. Third, sampling frequency can be an important consideration when capturing the water quality conditions of aquifers due to seasonal fluctuations in contaminant risk. And finally, private well water stewardship is a multifaceted, collaborative approach which must take into consideration a variety of knowledge and perceptions associated with aquifer protection.